the Lawrence Hall of Science has been around for about 50 years and has had for many of those years some kind of focus on environmental literacy. That it started with a focus on ocean science and ocean literacy and what that means, and has grown now to a whole portfolio of resources and projects that are all related to environmental education and environmental literacy. Beetles started about 6 years ago, specifically to try to take a lot of the best practices that we had been, that are in research and that the Lawrence Hall of Science had been applying to more formal settings, and to try to apply those best practices and teaching and learning to environmental education settings. And in the last 2 years-ish, a year and a half or so, we've really started focusing on equity and inclusion and kind of realizing that we'd had this philosophy of like good teaching is good for all students. And that's not a bad philosophy and it's not wrong, but we just realized that there was some gaps in how we were, the ways that we were talking or not talking about equity and inclusion and cultural relevance, and that we really needed to go back and revise our materials and develop new materials and new programs that could specifically address equity and inclusion and cultural relevance, and kind of that we've identified that as this like very critical aspect to the field right now in kind of continuing as an integral part of education in the US.
When you started kind of thinking through that lens, or seeing EE through that lens, were there any kind of immediate takeaways of where the field is with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion?
We knew from the Beatles Institutes that we were doing, where we would bring in leaders from organizations all over the country, that every single institute we had was predominantly white folks in those leadership roles. And so I think we were seeing the whiteness in the field. So every conference that we went to, there was someone or at least one presentation or discussion group or something around equity and inclusion and diversity. And we just kept hearing over and over again, like, well, there's no applicants of color. There's no applicants of color. How can we change when there's no applicants of color? And I think just hearing that over and over again was kind of like, that's so superficial. It's just scratching the surface of where we're at. The desire to try to understand the field better is really what fueled the research that Valeria led and that we presented on at NAAEE. So that was definitely our attempt to try to go beyond some anecdotes and say, like, okay, how can we kind of more systematically understand what's happening here?
The evaluation was really intended to try to understand sort of what are the sort of perspectives within organizations around equity and inclusion. How are organizations thinking about it? How are they operationalizing it in their practices and policies? And one of the things that sort of with input from the partners that we collectively felt was really important was to think about how we sort of shift the narrative from placing the burden on individuals, and in particularly communities of color or educators of color, and really place the narrative around organizational practices. But through that process, we also felt that it was really important to sort of think about how do we amplify the voices of educators of color to understand, what their experiences are like in terms of how organizations have been thinking about and operationalizing equity and inclusion. And so I say that to say that we sort of had this two-prong approach where we designed an organizational survey that was administered to leaders of organizations sort of at the highest level, so the CEO or the program director, that was aimed at sort of getting perspectives around how our organizations think about equity and inclusion, what does that look like in guiding statements, who are the learners that they're serving, does their staff represent their learners? So, sort of the wide spectrum of different aspects around equity and inclusion. And then we conducted focus group interviews with educators who identified as a person of color to gather their perspectives around the same thing. how are organizations thinking about equity and inclusion, and what is their experience like? And really, I think what emerged for us was, through the surveys, there was certainly this narrative around there being an intent around wanting to be equitable, wanting to be inclusive, because organizations wanted to support diverse learners, and sort of through that, then, understanding the recognition of supporting diverse staff, but really it being front and center around, we want to provide culturally responsive, equitable and inclusive learning experiences. And so that's where our equity and inclusion is really centered around. And through the educators, I think, the biggest thing that emerged through their feedback was, yes, there is this intent, but it's really focused around diversity and sort of this focus on numbers and bringing more Black and brown faces to learning experiences or to the work environment. And that there is not necessarily this explicit focus on really understanding what are the systemic issues that might be reinforcing an environment that's marginalizing, that's exclusive to people of color, particularly in the work environment. I think what was interesting is that through the educator focus groups, there was really this sort of challenge to say, like, sure, access might be one piece of that, but really it's trying to understand sort of what are the underlying systemic oppression, power, and privilege. How does that influence how we're thinking about equity, inclusion, and diversity? So really pushing the narrative beyond access and thinking about sort of what might be, like, how do we think about trying to understand sort of the historical oppression within environmental education and how that's influenced equity? How do we think about, or how do we get organizations to start listening to and learning about and sharing the narratives of the people, communities, and the land? That's really going to be driving organizations to think about inclusion in a different way. And that educators also sort of thought about diversity as requiring, oh, thanks, Jetta, for sharing that. That diversity was really about trying to understand the intersectionality of each of these, right? That they're not mutually exclusive, that they really are informing one another. And how does sort of the lack of diversity influence initiatives around equity and inclusion? So I felt like that's a really important narrative, and I think had really important implications for thinking about what were the next steps through this partnership. And, I think I think most of the partners sort of saw this and were like, yeah, that sounds right. Like, that's exactly what we should be doing.
That's sort of a recurring theme that surfaces a lot, is how are we as environmental educators also learning from, or how are we not staying siloed in our work, but what lessons can we learn from other sectors when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I'm trying to think about, like, do you all have advice for what that might look like to learn from other sectors? Or if I'm in a so-called traditional organization wanting to partner with a community-based organization or an environmental justice organization, what might that look like? Or where do you see those relationships building? Where do you see those first steps happening?
So we started working with Youth Outside, a couple years ago. And I think through our relationship with them and our partnership with them really kind of came to understand more the depth and complexity of equity and inclusion as it relates to environmental education and outdoor science. We're excited. I feel like we're kind of trying to kind of throw a lot of energy and focus into this work and see if we can, it feels like the field is kind of at a tipping point, and so kind of doing our effort to tip it over.